Hello. Today we're looking at literature text learning targets that answer the essential questions of 3, what strategies and resources do I use to figure out unknown vocabulary? 4, what's literary text really about? And 5, how does interaction with text provoke thinking and response? Today we're going to do a close reading of a poem. And so as we look at this poem, we're going to be in Actively Learn. And within Actively Learn, we are going to look at a poem that actually is comparative to the story Icarus's flight, because it's based on the flight of Icarus and it responds to, in poetic form, the flight of Icarus. In phase 1, we are going to be focusing on reading over the excerpt and looking at what the section is about. Remember, we close read with 3 phases, and in that first phase, we're reading for understanding. So we're going to read over the poem the first time, and I want you to think about what's happening in this poem and write a summary as a response. As you do that, you're going to be focusing in on looking at essential question number 5, which is to create an objective summary of a text. Within poetic form, you really need to figure out and summarize what's going on based on what the piece is about. Poetry sometimes does, in fact, contain narrative elements and have a conflict that is resolved at the end. But in some cases, poetry is to emphasize thoughts, feelings, and emotions of the speaker. So determine that and create your summary of what's happening in the poem as such. During the second phase of this, we are going to be focusing on the structure of the poem. You're going to read the poem and highlight key areas of the poem's structure, such as rhyme scheme, stanza numbers, line numbers, what the type of poem is, enjambment, sentence types, punctuation used. All of those elements I want you to think about and look for. And I want you to look at what's the impact of the structure of the poem. How does the structure contribute to the poem's meaning or theme? When you begin your response, you'll begin by saying the poem's written using this type of structural element. That element emphasizes something about the meaning of the poem. Let's look at what learning target that relates to. It's a new one, so make sure you get these notes copied down during interventions. This is learning target number 10, to analyze how a drama or poem form or structure contributes to its meaning. I want you to look closely at the form or structure. What that means is to look closely at the form or structure of a poem in this case, for how the layout, how it looks literally on the page, and the features of its layout on the page, how those features contribute to the poem's meaning. To talk about what the structure means, what the layout on the page looks like. With poems, we're looking at the rhyme scheme. We're looking at the meter, which is the beat pattern, the ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum as you read it. We're looking at any headings or titles. We're looking at punctuation. Is it used? Is it not used? What types of punctuation marks are used? Enjambment, that's a poetic term, which means that when a poem line ends, usually poets end a poetic line with a punctuation mark. But sometimes they use enjambment, which is where the line from one end of the poem continues on to the next. And even though that you might be middle of a sentence and have no end punctuation, when you have enjambment, we don't necessarily continue on to the next line really quickly. We still have that dramatic pause at the end of each line, even though there is no, in fact, punctuation mark. That creates emphasis within the line that causes us to look at what the line's about more closely. Because where the author ends a line with enjambment, they do that to emphasize other words within the lines. Also, poetic structure includes types of sentences used by the author. Or do we use declarative sentences? Are we using interrogative sentences? Are we using commands? Are we using specific sentences, and why? Are we using those types of sentences for a reason? When you see this question in test form, you're going to see it being asked as, what's the impact of the structure? And to answer that, you may want to start with, this poem uses a blah. So you would say this poem uses this structural element and be specific of what you see structure-wise as one of these things. And that emphasizes, and then you would say what that does for the poem's meaning, how it emphasizes a certain aspect or feature or idea in the poem because of using that type of sentence. It emphasizes an idea in the poem from using enjambment. It emphasizes a specific idea from the poem by having a specific rhyme scheme. It emphasizes a specific idea in the poem by choosing to use a specific type of punctuation mark. So you need to think about what's the structural element, and by using that structural element, what in fact is getting emphasized with the ideas or message that the poem is about or conveying. That's phase 2. Phase 3, we are going back to the standard, why is this poem matter, which is when we read it the third and final time and we look to decide that deeper meaning, that big message. So as we look at that, we'll be looking at learning target number 3, determine a theme or central idea of the text, which is to decide the hidden message or meaning that the writing is conveying that can connect to all readers, as well as how that theme develops over the entire poem. Throughout all 3 phases, make sure that you are answering your questions clearly. That's you making your claim, your opinion, your solid opinion that answers the question being asked of you. And then support the answer that you are making, that claim you're making for what the question's asked, with evidence from the passage. Please do that with phase 2 and 3 only. Provide a quote. You'll notice within phase 2 and 3 of the close reading, I do ask for you to highlight and margin note. That would be the evidence that you want to quote within the answer response. So go ahead and get started on today's close reading of the poem, Icarus's Flight.